Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist and also a famed proponent of what is today often called the New Atheism. And in his book, The God Delusion, he says the following: faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. But my question would be, is it true that faith is really blind? Is it true that faith cannot, as Dawkins says, brook an argument? Faith really have no justification? Are faith and reason truly opposed to one another? Are they really mutually exclusive? Is it a real choice between faith or reason, faith or logic, faith or science? And in particular, the foundation of faith, Christian faith, would be the existence of God. And is the existence of God really a matter of blind faith? Or are there good, sound reasons to consider the question of God's existence? Welcome to Deep Wells. We're going to be discussing, as always, ancient insights into enduring questions, and today we pick up where we left off in our last episode, discussing this pivotal, fundamental question: does God exist? In our last episode, we talked about Ludwig Feuerbach, who was a German philosopher that basically turned the Judeo-Christian tradition on its head and said that it is God who is created in mankind's image. And of course, that's a play on the Judeo-Christian concept that we see in Genesis chapter 1, that it was, in fact, mankind, humanity, that was made in the image, in the likeness of God. And so I want to discuss this further today. Does God exist? Of course, as I said before in the last episode, this is a huge question, and certainly develops over time. The logical arguments, certainly the conversation is long-standing, it's very robust. We discussed in our last episode even the question of fundamental belief in the spiritual world. Was that something that was always there in humanity? It looks like, according to some anthropologists, that polytheism was the default setting, and then over time that moved into monotheism. But I would argue that monotheism was actually the default setting, and that polytheism developed as a result of mankind's separation from God. Of course, that's the argument from the Christian perspective. But going to this question of does God exist, as we pick it up again today, this is such a deep, deep topic. I hope that I can make it interesting for you. I hope that this will be food for thought, at least. These are heavy, heavy ideas. I'm not going to pretend that this is an easy question to answer, and this is certainly not a topic that can be fully delved into on a podcast like this or even an entire series. This is going to be kind of a 30,000-foot overview, just to give us a broad lay of the land, some of the arguments. I also, full disclosure, I am not a professional philosopher, and some of these philosophies and these arguments that we're going to be discussing are very heady, and people that are a lot smarter than I am have spent their lifetime and spilled a lot of ink developing and arguing these ideas. And so we're just going to look at them as an overview, and I hope that today, at the very least, that I can give you some exposure to these ideas, some exposure to these arguments for God's existence, something to chew on, something to meditate on, and maybe uh, upset some of your own presuppositions, perhaps. And I think it's through that type of robust dialogue, that robust intellectual examination, that you and I can actually really find out what it is that we truly believe. And so I pray that this is very, very encouraging to you, and that it would be insightful. And yes, I did say I pray that. So obviously you know where I'm coming from. But even if you are an avowed atheist, I think that you'll find this very interesting, and hopefully it'll be food for thought. And I've basically got several arguments for God that we're going to work through. And I've ordered them starting with my least preferred, the least favorite, and kind of working to the more preferred ones. And, each of these has their own merits. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses. I don't think that any one of these arguments is going to be a conclusive empirical proof of God's existence. Kind of like what I said in the prior episode. I don't think that in terms of epistemology, in terms of that understanding of knowledge, the sources and limitations of knowledge, I don't think that there's ever a point where we can have in our human experience an exhaustive knowledge or an exhaustive certainty of God's existence. I just believe, as I often say, for me, my Christian faith doesn't answer all my questions, but it leaves me with less question marks than any other alternative. So, the first argument for the existence of God I want to get into is called the ontological argument. Of course, ontology or ontological, that has to do with the philosophy of being, the philosophy of what things are in their essence, at their core. And this ontological argument was known as the Anselmic argument during the Middle Ages and after, because it was propounded by a man named Anselm of Canterbury. He lived in the 11th and early 12th century, and he was actually the Bishop of Canterbury in England. And the basic idea, the kind of crux of this ontological argument, is that God is the greatest and the most perfect possible being. And in the words of Anselm, he argued it this way in a writing that's called the Proslogion. I mean, who came up with these names? I mean, wow. If this was a publisher and Anselm came into the office to publish this book, I'm thinking they would probably shoot it down in marketing and come up with something really catchy. But anyway, the Proslogion, Anselm argues that God is essentially, and I quote here, a being than which none greater can be conceived. A being than which none greater can be conceived. Essentially, God is the greatest and most perfect being. And so, according to his logic, according to his train of thought, if God is the greatest conceivable being, then God cannot exist only in the mind. Why would that be? Well, he says it's because a being that exists in reality is even greater than one that exists only in the mind or only in the imagination. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of this argument, and there's several reasons for that, but basically it comes down to this, that, okay, even if that premise is true, the question of that a being that exists in reality is even greater than one that exists in the mind, you know, my question is that premise even true? Can a being exist only in the mind? Is that even true existence? Is imagination existence at all? So there's a question there. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this premise is true and that a being that exists in reality is even greater than one that exists only in the imagination. Okay, if we accept that, that still doesn't create a logical necessity that that greater being exists in fact. It doesn't create necessary existence. It's not a logical necessity that such a being should exist. And in fact, that's the very argument that one of Anselm's contemporaries and one of his detractors was saying, and his name was Gaunilo. He was a monk, and he made this argument in response to Anselm, and he essentially made the same argument that Anselm made, but instead of God, he talked about an imaginary island. This kind of reminds me of the atheists today that would talk about, I don't have to prove, for example, the existence of a purple intergalactic unicorn, this type of thing. Well, Gaunilo made the same argument essentially. He talked about an imaginary island, and hey, if I imagine this great island, an island than which none greater can be conceived, he said that that is not going to make the existence of such an island necessary. It's not going to necessitate the existence of such an island. That island could, in fact, only exist in the mind. And so Anselm counter-argued that God, as a necessary being, is unique. But that, in my mind, begs the question, is God necessary? And again, I'm not arguing that I don't believe in God. I'm just saying that the logic of this argument really seems to be circular reasoning in my mind. And again, we're just looking at this in a very broad view, and we'll keep it moving just for the sake of time. But that is an argument for God that is common. It's out there. Not my favorite. The next one that I wanted to delve into a little bit is often called the moral argument. Some of these have various names, but the gist of it is understandable. The moral argument, and the core idea of this moral argument is that the existence of objective moral laws implies the existence of a divine lawgiver, an absolute being that establishes the foundation for morality, the foundation for ethics, etc. And the argument basically is, if moral values are not merely subjective, if moral values are not just what I as a person decide or you as a person decide, if they're not merely subjective, then they must have a source outside of human creation, human subjects, human people. If moral values are not subjective, then they must appeal essentially to an ultimate source of authority, which would be God. However, again, this does beg the question, maybe moral values, someone could make the argument, maybe morals are subjective. Maybe, I prefer not to kill, but maybe you like to kill. I prefer not to steal, but maybe you love stealing and it's part of your identity. And so people would argue, well, hey, it's just your truth against my truth. It's your opinion against my opinion. And you could say, for example, well, who's to say Hitler was wrong, or any other of the, villains of history? Who's to say that their activities were morally right or wrong? It's just basically a subjective argument. Well, one way that that's countered without an appeal to God is to say, well, it's just utilitarian. It's basically just what is the greatest good for the highest number of people possible. Now, that might sound like a great argument, that we essentially as human beings have established moral laws because we know through experience, through time-honored tradition, that certain activities lead to greater benefit or lesser benefit, not just for individuals, but for society, for our collective communities. The trouble with that is still highly subjective. There's still no one who can be that ultimate authority. We're still left with subjectivity. Who gets to decide what is the greatest good for the most amount of people? There's still no standard of right or wrong without that ultimate authority. It's still all subjective. And so really, I don't see how a person without an appeal to God can actually maintain under any circumstance morals or ethics that are not subjective. It seems like it always reverts back to subjectivity, personal opinion, personal truth in today's parlance. But if we were to agree that morals, values, ethics are not merely subjective, then, according to the moral argument, those morals and ethics must have a source outside of human creation, pointing to a transcendent moral authority, which is God. So that's the moral argument. The next one I want to touch on is called the argument from design. Sometimes it's called the teleological argument, but that's not quite as easy to say. So most people know it as the argument from design, and it's essentially the idea that the intricate and ordered design in the universe suggests an intelligent purpose, a purposeful creator, rather than just a series of random events. Often there's a comparison made to a watch, the complexity and the intricacy of a watch. We can't imagine a watch coming together and functioning as a random series of events unless there were an actual watchmaker. That watch would not exist. And extrapolating that and arguing ad majorem, it would make sense, according to this argument, that the complexity and the balance that we see in the universe would suggest that there is an intelligent creator, a mind behind all of this, a designer. Well, the critics would say, well, it is just a random series of accidents. It is just a random series of events that had no purpose. They were not intended. They just happened. And it's just because we happen to exist in this infinitesimal chance. And because we have consciousness, because we have intelligence in our mind, it looks like intelligent design because we do in fact exist, but it really is just a fine chance that we landed where we are. It only gives the appearance. It only gives the illusion. My rebuttal to that would be, and you say Christians have blind faith? I don't know if I have enough faith to believe that this universe just happened to exist and just happened to be something instead of nothing, and then there just happened to be elements and there happened to be chemical reactions and energy to start with to get everything moving. And then, we don't even have time to discuss all of the chain of events that would have to happen to get to where you and I are listening and watching this podcast right now. That is crazy. A crazy amount of things would have to happen. And when you look at the fine tuning arguments, we don't have time to get into it today. It's a fascinating subject, but the fine tuning of the universe, the amount of things that have to go right, and really right by a very large margin, it's mind-boggling, the fact that life exists in this universe. It's just crazy. I mean, we don't have time, maybe another episode or a series of episodes, but the question of fine-tuning of the universe is just fascinating, and it's very compelling. And so I think that this argument from design is a very strong argument for the existence of God. But the last argument I want to share today is called the cosmological argument. And this is actually my favorite argument. I'll tell you why in just a moment. But the cosmological argument, it gets its most well-known name is the Kalam cosmological argument. And that actually comes from the medieval Islamic school of the Kalam. And the Muslims actually were very instrumental in recovering and preserving and even promoting many of the ideas of some of the Greek philosophers that had somewhat been lost to the Christian West, to the Latin West for various reasons. And so hats off to the Muslim scholars of the Middle Ages for preserving those things for posterity. But the Kalam school really refined and we maybe could say perfected in some way this argument, this cosmological argument for the existence of God. It was somewhat, I'm sure, influenced by Greek philosophy and Aristotle. it kind of goes to this idea of the necessity of an essential or let's say an eternal first mover or first cause, God, we would say, that set everything off, that essentially pushed over the first domino, that we see the effects. And if we follow that series of causes and effects and move up the chain of causation, that at some point we'll get to the first cause, the first mover. The Kalam cosmological argument, there's a very famous proponent of this view that I really enjoy listening to, Dr. William Lane Craig. And Dr. Craig, if you're watching, I'd love to get you on the podcast at some point. Maybe we could talk about this argument, but he really helped to sort of revive it for many people in the English-speaking world today. But what is this argument? Essentially, I've kind of touched on it, but it's the idea that the universe must have a cause. When we see an effect, there must be a cause. When we see a manifestation or a phenomenon behind it, there must be something that reaches back into that chain of causation, and a cause cannot be uncaused. That something cannot just happen for no reason at all. And so following that first cause must be God himself. This really is my favorite of the arguments that we've discussed today. One of the reasons that I really prefer this is because it does seem to line up with empirical science. It does seem to fare very well with what we know about physics, the laws of physics. And we're constantly discovering more about that, but the fundamentals of physics are well established. And, this cosmological argument or this argument from causality seems to hold hands very well with empirical science. So I like it for that reason. It does underscore for me an interesting fact, and maybe you've thought about this, but whether you're an atheist or a theist, whether you're an agnostic or a Bible-believing Christian or something in between, any of these extremes, maybe you don't even know where you stand. What's amazing to me is that we are all left to ponder this magnificent universe that we live in. It is a wonder. It's a marvel, no matter how you look at it and no matter what you imagine concerning its origin. This magnificent universe that we're all left to grapple with the existence of. This magnificent universe that we know so little about in many ways. This universe that we inhabit, the origin of which, from either angle, is both a mystery and a miracle. And I would leave you to think about some of these things, and I hope that you've enjoyed our conversation today. This is Michael Lusk with Deep Wells, where we're exploring ancient insights into enduring questions.